must give a warning prior to using any CW electronic control weapon if feasible. 12 Final foot pursuit. After the taser proved ineffective, Mr. Vila again ran from the officers, and Officer Gradwell resumed the chase with Officer Derry 5 to 10 feet behind him. During the pursuit, Officer Gradwell estimated that he was 15 to 20 feet behind Mr. Vila. Officer Gradwell continued the pursuit with his weapon unholstered. During the chase, Officer Gradwell observed that Mr. Vida's right arm was fixed at his waistband while his left arm was pumping in a running motion. Officer Gradwell also observed Mr. Vida repeatedly looking back at him during the pursuit. The training analysis had a number of concerns with Officer Gradwell's tactics during this final foot pursuit. First, the training analysis noted that if officers believe a subject is armed, they should implement a tactical apprehension or some other plan. In discussing preference for a tactical apprehension, for instance, following at a distance while waiting for additional resources for apprehension, the training analysis noted that pursuing an armed subject places the officers at a tactical disadvantage and will greatly increase risk factors, and that PPP officers should increase their following distance of an armed subject. The training analysis also noted that PPP officers should attempt to maintain visual contact without the intent to apprehend while waiting for additional resources, consider setting up a perimeter, seek cover, and request other assets such as K9 and SCRT. The training analysis noted that Officer Gradwell's pursuing distance of 15 to 20 feet would not have allowed him much time to react should Mr. Vida commence an attack, which in fact he did eventually do. The training analysis concluded that the officer's safest option would have been to create and maintain more distance and radio for backup units to begin to set up a perimeter. The training analysis also noted that officers should avoid engaging in a foot pursuit with their weapons unholstered because of the dangers that an officer might stumble and fall and lose control of his or her weapon at a critical moment, that the officer could quickly become involved in a physical struggle with an unholstered weapon, and that it increases the possibility of an accidental discharge. However, rather than critique the officer for this technique, the training analysis apparently accepted Officer Gradwell's explanation that he wanted his firearm in his hand should Mr. Vida pull a gun on him. While a pursuing officer could always use this explanation, in this case, it again belies the 13 unwise choice Officer Gradwell made in pursuing an armed suspect the way he did. The training analysis noted that pursuing officers should be aware of the hand and arm movements of the suspect and whether the suspect is looking back or targeting the officer. The training analysis concluded that Mr. Vida had displayed a number of behaviors consistent with an armed fleeing person. The analysis concluded that the safest option would have been to create distance and seek tactical apprehension, yet Officer Gradwell actually closed the distance during the pursuit. The analysis noted that as a result, Officer Gradwell was very close, without cover, and in motion, when Mr. Vida began shooting at him. The commander's review memorandum expressed similar concern about the officer's pursuit of an armed suspect. It is easily conceivable that the rounds that put the officers, especially Gradwell, in harm's way might have found their mark and the outcome would have been tragic. I am reminded of the Thomas Jeffries shooting in the summer of 1997. In this situation, Officer Jeffries pursued the suspect into a backyard and only briefly lost sight of him. As he came around the corner, the suspect fired around that landing between the ballistic panels on the vest he was wearing. The round killed Officer Jeffries. The commander indicated that while he found the shooting well within policy, he recommended that the involved officers be debriefed on foot pursuits and that the training division develop training around this and other incidents. One critical fact not discussed in the training analysis is that when Mr. Vida rounded the car just before he started firing, both officers lost sight of him momentarily. When the officers next saw Mr. Vida, he had the gun pointed at Officer Gradwell and began firing. Best practices instruct officers to stop pursuing whenever they lose sight of the suspect and seek cover. In this case, there is no evidence that Officer Gradwell ever intended to stop pursuing once he lost sight of the suspect. At the time of the incident, training had been initiated on the inherent dangerousness of foot pursuits and officer safety tactics and principles designed to reduce their danger. But the Bureau did not yet have a directive outlining its expectations on initiation and handling of foot pursuits. In fact, as discussed later 14 in this report, the Bureau did subsequently develop and implement a directive regarding foot pursuits. Positioning and tactical decision-making during the shooting. When Mr. Vida began firing on Officer Gradwell, the officer immediately returned fire, using a one-handed grip. Officer Gradwell then moved away from Mr. Vida, toward a parked car for cover. As Officer Derry passed between cars, he heard gunfire and saw a muzzle flash. He then saw Mr. Vida firing a handgun at Officer Gradwell. Officer Derry drew his weapon and began firing at Mr. Vida. Officer Derry moved away from Mr. Vida and positioned himself behind the corner of a building. After Officer Gradwell went around the parked car, he took a kneeling position and began using a two-handed grip. Officer Gradwell used up all of the ammunition in his pistol, performed a reload, and continued to fire at Mr. Vida. Officer Gradwell stated that he began to focus on his sights and slow his rate of fire. Officer Gradwell said that he was aware of his backdrop and stopped firing at one point until a car passed by, and also stopped firing when Mr. Vida went down. He stated that when Mr. Vida attempted to get back up, Officer Gradwell fired again. Mr. Vida went down a second time and Officer Gradwell stopped firing. Officer Gradwell estimated the distance between him and Mr. Vida during the initial exchange of gunfire at 10 to 15 feet and at the end of the sequence at about 30 yards. Officer Gradwell fired a total of 30 rounds at Mr. Vida. Officer Derry said that he fired from an upright stance. He said that his distance from Mr. Vida was initially 15 to 20 feet and approximately 30 feet at the end of the firing sequence. Officer Derry said that he initially fired rapidly, attempting to center his front sight on Mr. Vida. Officer Derry stated that he was concerned that Mr. Veida was not going down and slowed down his last shots in order to use his sights more carefully. Officer Derry said that he stopped firing when Mr. Veida went down. Officer Derry said that his backdrop during the shooting was parked cars and shrubbery. Officer Derry fired 9 rounds at Mr. Veida. Mr. Veida fired 5 rounds at Officer Gradwell before his firearm malfunctioned. Mr. Veida received multiple gunshot wounds during the exchange but survived the encounter. 15. The training analysis found that the use of deadly force by the officers was consistent with PPP training. While the training analysis recognized that a two-handed grip using sights is the preferred method of firing, the dynamic situation of the officers being fired upon made instinct shooting a survival reality. The training analysis concluded that the officers were aware of their backdrop. In reaching its conclusion, the training analysis assumed certain facts that were not established during the investigation and, as illustrated above, neglected discussing certain facts that were clearly established. For example, the analysis stated that Officer Gradwell likely had his flashlight in his support hand when he began firing. However, there is no evidence to support this conclusion since Officer Gradwell did not know whether he had his flashlight in his hand at the time of the shooting. Second, while the training analysis concludes that both officers were aware of their backdrop, a number of rounds struck residential buildings and vehicles. Unfortunately, the investigation did not document which officer or whether Mr. Veida likely fired the stray rounds, so it is impossible to assess whether the involved officers were as fully aware of their backdrop as they asserted. The training analysis does not assess the number of rounds fired by the officers and whether the amount was consistent with training. The fact that Officer Gradwell fired 3 rounds during this encounter should have, in and of itself, raised conservation of ammunition questions and called for exacting analysis. In addition, at one point, Officer Gradwell's weapon was out of bullets, a circumstance that most training regiments instruct officers to avoid. Moreover, the time it took to tactically reload provided Officer Gradwell an opportunity to reassess the threat level presented by Mr. Veida, but there is no evidence to suggest that the officer did so, and the training analysis does not identify or assess this issue. Specialized officers may lose perishable skills. The training analysis noted that the 2 involved officers' assignment to the gang enforcement team was largely investigative. Both officers spent the majority of their time in plain clothes, working as part of a larger team, conducting investigations and surveillance. The training analysis noted that some basic uniform patrol skills, which may have once come naturally to them, such as notifying dispatch of their stop and location and immediately broadcasting the foot pursuit, were no longer automatic. The training analysis indicated that the manifold survival skills inherent in uniform patrol tactics are perishable. While 16. This observation demonstrates a keen insight into how Bureau officers assigned to non-patrol positions could be disadvantaged should they need to perform patrol tactics. The analysis provided no suggestions on how this phenomenon could be addressed on a going-forward basis. Recommendation 1. The Bureau should review current protocols to determine whether they adequately ensure that officers in specialized units are receiving sufficient training regarding perishable skills necessary to perform patrol functions. Post-shooting analysis. After the shooting sequence ended, Officers Gradwell and Derry observed Mr. Veida down with his handgun on the ground. The officers commanded him to lay still. Officer Derry radioed that they had been involved in a shooting, provided the location, and requested medical to respond. Officer Gradwell broadcasted a safe approach route for responding officers. The officers directed bystanders away from the area. Once responding officers arrived, Officers Gradwell and Derry were relieved by other officers and escorted from the scene. AR-15 rifle operators were positioned to cover Mr. Veida. Medical support was staged nearby. Mr. Veida continued to refuse commands to lay still and no attempt was made to approach him. SCRT was activated to take Mr. Veida into custody. A responding officer was directed by an on-scene sergeant to use a less lethal shotgun to shoot out an overhead light that he believed was illuminating the positions of the cover officers. The officer indicated that he fired 5-6 rounds at the light before he was successful. At the time, the officer said the pistol was still on the ground, approximately 7 to 10 feet from Mr. Veida. The training analysis concluded that the use of the less lethal shotgun was probably the safest and most expedient tool to disable the light. However, the analysis contains no discussion about whether the light was negatively impacting the tactical response of cover officers, perhaps in part because the investigation did not produce any information critical to such an assessment. Ideally, experts from the Bureau would have traveled to the scene and examined whether the light was an impediment to successful apprehension of Mr. Veida. As a general principle, it is low light, not the existence of light, that makes tactical planning more difficult. Second, the less lethal shotgun is not designed to shoot out 17 streetlights, and the reporting officer noted it took a number of rounds before he was able to successfully break the light. The investigation did not attempt to learn how readily the light could have been turned off by contacting the city power company before using the less lethal shotgun in this unorthodox way. Mr. Veida continued to reach about himself. The officer who shot out the overhead light warned Mr. Veida that if he did not stop moving, he would be shot with less lethal munitions. When Mr. Veida again reached for something, the officer struck Mr. Veida in the leg with 1 round of less lethal. Mr. Veida was observed pulling off his shirt, and when he placed his hands out of view, the officer fired 3 more rounds of less lethal at him, which the officer indicated struck Mr. Veida in the leg. SCRT ultimately used an armored vehicle to approach Mr. Veida, handcuffed him, and transported him to an ambulance. The training analysis found that the post-shooting actions of Officers Gradwell and Derry were consistent with training, noting that they continued to use cover, communicated with each other, broadcast their location and situation, directed responding units, and directed bystanders to safety. The training analysis also found the actions taken by the first arriving backup officers and supervisors consistent with training. The backup officers installed cover units with AR-15 rifle operators, relieved officers Gradwell and Derry and removed them from the scene, evacuated bystanders, established perimeters and designated a command post. The training analysis concluded that because of the lack of cooperation displayed by Mr. Veida and his proximity to the gun, it was appropriate to activate the SCRT team for a hazardous, post-shooting approach to a suspect. The training analysis also found that the use of the less lethal shotgun against Mr. Veida with prior warnings was consistent with training. As a result of the necessary time lag needed to activate SCRT, over an hour elapsed between the time of the shooting and when Mr. Veida began to receive medical attention, even though such assets were on scene within a few minutes of the radio request for medical aid. The training analysis does not discuss any alternatives to waiting for ACRT or any possible plans for more quickly apprehending Mr. Veida. While Mr. Veida was observed to be moving about and retrieving and using his cell phone, none of the actions were described as aggressive, and no officers observed an attempt by Mr. Veida to rearm himself. Fortunately, Mr. Veida survived this encounter. A more immediate approach, however, would have provided Mr. Veida more immediate medical attention and 18 avoided the perceived need to use non-lethal munitions in an attempt to keep him from moving around. This incident echoes earlier critiques regarding the apparent slowness in assessing conditions and providing medical attention to individuals down by an officer's use of deadly force. As we noted in our first report, PPB, to its credit, has recently responded to those criticisms by outfitting and training its officers to use a ballistic shield in order to approach downed individuals and take them into custody so that paramedics can more readily provide medical assistance. Quality of investigation and review. Lack of independent follow-up in IA investigation. As we have noted in our earlier report, during this time frame, IA had a practice of not conducting its own interviews but simply relying on the interviews and other information gathered during the criminal investigation. While the detectives' interviews of the involved officers are relatively thorough, there are gaps in information that could have been addressed by subsequent administrative interviews. Additionally, because the detective's investigation is focused on the question of whether the use of deadly force was legal, administrative interviews are needed to address other tactical issues. For example,